Hello, Elliot Ackerman. Welcome to Interabang Author Chats. How are
Thanks
you
for having me.
today?
I'm great.
Tell me where you are.
I am right near the Delaware, Pennsylvania state line, out in the countryside, fortunately. So, and doing my self-isolation out here for COVID.
Well, looks like you're getting some sunshine today.
Yeah, nice day.
So, we're here to talk about your soon to be released novel in just a few days, um, Red Dress in Black and White. I love this novel. I loved your last novel, Waiting for Eden, as well. This one has a lot of intriguing aspects to it. So I'm very anxious to talk to you about what you were thinking when you were writing it. Do you want to set the stage for us, though, a little bit and tell us a little bit about what it's about and maybe read a passage?
Yeah, great. So, um, structurally, the book takes place over a single day and or a single 24-hour period, and it focuses on a cast of kind of about 4 or 5 characters. Central among them is an American woman named Catherine, who is living in Istanbul with her Turkish husband, Murat, who is a real estate developer. Except Catherine is having an affair with an American photographer who's sort of trying to make his career work inside of Istanbul. And one evening, she decides that she's going to take her young son with her and flee the city. And so the 24-hour period that this takes place over are those 24 hours where she's trying to flee the city. And she's trying to do that with Peter, her American photographer lover. It's not a particularly well-hatched plan that she's come up with. And her husband, Murat, is trying to undermine that plan. And what you start to see as he tries to prevent her from leaving is the architecture of the life that they built for themselves in Istanbul. And the architecture of that life brings in many other characters, one of whom is a museum curator who's very active in the LGBTQ community inside of Istanbul. One is an American woman who's working at the consulate in Istanbul. And also the events that are going on in kind of contemporary Turkish society, most centrally among those being the 2013 protests in Gezi Park. And for any readers who aren't familiar with those, they were sort of like the Turkish equivalent of the Arab Spring protests. And they were really the largest challenge to the Turkish government in decades, and really began several years up to today kind of reforms that have taken a lot of constitutional power away from the people inside of Turkey. So the book is kind of one part romance, one part spy novel even, and one part political book. And it's very much engaging with how the personal very quickly becomes the political and kind of toggles between those two worlds. So that being said, why don't I read a passage?
Great.
Okay. So the part I'd like to read is a scene with Peter. Remember, that's our the photographer, and Catherine. And it's a flashback, and it's to one of the first nights that they've met. And they're coming out of a art exhibition, and they're walking across the Bosphorus Bridge between Asia and Europe, and this is sort of their exchange. It opens up though with Peter having this flashback, and so because it's totaled over 24 hours, each chapter kind of has these timestamps on it. So I'll begin with that timestamp. 3:30 a.m. His apartment has a view. It seems they all do. This is an advantage of living in a terraced city, one that reaches into the hills. The window by Peter's bed looks out on the first Bosphorus Bridge. Its spans and cables are ornamented with turquoise LED lights that reflect off the water, which glides past like black oil. The strong current swirls in the light, and the surface of the deep strait swims with color. 40 years before, the bridge's construction had been touted as a great triumph. even though an unspoken shame surrounded its completion. Why had it taken more than a millennia to connect the two sides of this city? Looking at the bridge, he thinks of his exhibit from earlier in the evening, of Denise and the others, including Catherine, staring at two disconnected versions of themselves. These many years later, the bridge has not had the desired effect. After Gezi Park, the country is riven with divisions, and in this way, Peter can understand the shame associated with a bridge built too late. His head is on the pillow as he watches the current, hoping it might hypnotize him to sleep. The sunrise is still a few hours off, yet his mind roams, keeping him awake. Catherine knows he plans to leave. He feels certain of it. He feels equally certain that she can't come with him, even if he wanted her to, which he doubts. She is bound up in Murat and their son. Perhaps this is why he had succumbed to their affair in the first place, because he knew that it could go nowhere, that it had to finish in this way. And since he already understood the nature of its ending, he could be absolved of responsibility, for they both knew this was the inevitable destination. As Peter looks at the bridge, his thoughts stray to what he considers their first night. Although they had met for dinner once before at the Istanbul Modern, this meeting occurred a few days later when they had bumped into one another at a gallery opening for the controversial artist Taner Ceylan, whose violent, sexually charged, and hyper-realist paintings resembled photographs. After the event, they had searched the crowded streets for a taxi and had then wandered onto the bridge, which was more like a highway and usually closed for people to walk across. But it was open that day, so they had chosen to cross it together and, perhaps with a bit of luck, to find a ride home on its far side. In the center of the bridge, she had approached the railing, staring 200 feet below at the dark, churning current. She waved Peter toward her so that he might look as well. "Come here, Peter." He remained a few steps from the railing and didn't move. "Don't you want to look? We're right between Europe and Asia. We're not on any continent." She leaned deeply over the railing. "This bridge is my favorite place in the city." "This whole city is a bridge," said Peter. "Maybe so," said Catherine. The Bosphorus ran dense as mercury beneath them. Peter glanced to its banks, to the two continents, to Istanbul, a city so illuminated that it vanished the power of the moon. "But you can't live on a bridge." "Why don't you come back from the railing?" Peter suggested. "Are you afraid of heights?" she asked. The wind was quick to carry away her voice, and he could barely understand her. "Everyone has one existential fear," she continued. But now she wasn't looking down. Instead, she stared at him, and he could see the light from the water reflected from below, its projection playing off her eyes. "For instance, my husband, his fear is that he won't be a success, or at least that he won't measure up to his father." Peter offered a confused look, revealing the absurdity of this fear for a man whose business conquests riddled the skyline. "It's not as ridiculous as you may think. None of us see ourselves as others see us. If only we could. Our vision of ourselves is like our voice. The world hears us one way, but inside our head, our voice sounds entirely different. There's no possibility of recording that voice, of sharing it with anyone. We go our whole lives without another person ever hearing us the way we hear ourselves. How people see themselves is the same, and there's no clearer way to understand that differing vision than to understand those insecurities, to understand that one fear." It had rained the hour before, and the bridge light shone on the wet pathway. He asked what her fear was. "Why should I tell you?" He took one cautious step and then another, shuffling his feet as he transferred his weight, as though at any moment, while he was drawing closer to her, the ground beneath him might fall away. Then he lunged forward and gripped the railing as desperately as if it were flotsam on the open ocean. He glanced up at her, smiling the heedless smile of an idiot. his eyes searching for some reaction, as if she might reward what he perceived to be his conquest of fear. Or, put another way, his courage when grasping the railing, even though he was paralyzed by heights. That night, as they stood on the bridge, the wind kept snatching away their voices. Peter had needed to lean in close to Catherine so that he could be heard. The idea of falling terrifies me, he confessed. I can feel the vertigo in my stomach. The vertigo isn't from your fear of falling, she said. It's from your hidden desire to jump. That's why we feel vertigo. Peter pressed his body against the railing and took another deep look at the water below. So are you going to tell me your fear, he asked. You weren't paying attention, she said. I just did. She told him to feel how her heart was beating. He reached for her wrist to take her pulse, but she said, we aren't children, are we? And placed his hand elsewhere. They had continued their crossing, and on the far side, they finally found a cab. He held open the door for her, and they climbed inside. Peter gave the driver his address. When he glanced back at Catherine so that she might give her address as well, she said nothing. Their taxi climbed the steep, winding roads, and through her omission, they both made their way back to his apartment. Neither of them spoke. Their eyes avoided one another's in the back seat. Past the door, a rocky bluff plunged hundreds of feet below. Peter was torn toward his window, away from her. He couldn't help but look at the drop.
A great passage. Thank you.
Thanks.
Maybe I'll start my many questions in my head with what inspired you to set the novel in Istanbul?
Well, I lived in Istanbul for about 3 years. So, and it was immediately kind of after the Gezi Park protests. And so you could feel, among my Turkish friends and others, how like profound that political event was for them. In much the same way, I'd say like the 2016 election was a profound event in America's political life. So I could feel how it was sort of rippling out into society, and I was interested in how it was affecting people's personal lives as well, because you could clearly see it. I mean, obviously, I was the outsider, but I could also see how it was affecting, members of the expatriate community who are trying to make lives there. And so this book sort of straddles those two worlds of people who live in Turkey and then also the expatriates who live in Istanbul. And Istanbul has always been, an incredibly cosmopolitan city, with people from all over the world passing through there, whether for a few nights or weeks, or people from all over the world making their lives there. So that is sort of what inspired setting the novel there.
And the novel explores different questions about love and politics and art. On the art side, I would say the main focus is photography. And are you a photographer yourself?
Not past the amateur stage, but I think, Peter is this photographer, and that's how he expresses himself. And there's a line he has sort of early on where he's talking to William, who is Catherine's adopted son. And William kind of has this nominal interest in photography too. And that's how the two of them form a connection. And he says to William, he's like, listen, sometimes, because William's getting frustrated, he can't take any good pictures. And he's saying, listen, you got to tell somebody you have to take 100 good photos or 100 bad photos to get one good one. And then Peter thinks to himself, but also sometimes you just take 100 bad photos. And so I think with Peter, you see he is a person who's really sort of, he is struggling to figure out who he is, and the way he expresses himself is through his art, and his art form is photography. And it's that desire to make the impermanent and transient permanent. And I think that exists not only in his character, but also exists in this city, because this is a city that people are passing in and out of. And so because of all of the turnover, there's that kind of question of, what here is impermanent and what is permanent. And for this little boy, William, who so much of the book revolves around, he is trying to figure out amongst the people in his life who is permanent and who is impermanent.
Yeah. And for him, I think that's a difficult task because the adults in his life seem, um, I guess, I don't know whether preoccupied would be the word I'm looking for, but they definitely have different things going on that maybe parenthood or his kind of day-to-day feelings and activities might not be the first priority on their list.
Yeah, I think most of them you would not characterize as being the most attentive parents. And you see a lot of them. You see Marat in retrospect. You see Catherine in retrospect. But then you also have the present. There's one day that all the immediate action is happening, and you sort of see over the course of the book, I don't want to spoil things, but how those parents react in this moment of crisis. And you sort of, I guess, see what they're made of. And I think that is part of, the reveals of the book, that some of the characters, at least when I was writing, they sort of surprised me as to what they were going to do in any given situation.
So in addition to the child William, I'd say that there's 4 or 5 adults really that kind of their connections and interrelationships kind of propel the novel. We talked about Catherine and Marat, the parents of William, and then there's Peter, Catherine's lover, who's the photographer. Another character is Deniz, who's a Turkish man and curator of an art gallery, and with kind of a hard scramble past, I would say. And then Kristen. And so a lot of the novel revolves around the politics of the Gezi Park protests, et cetera. But then there's Kristen, who works at the consulate, and she's kind of got her own very, I would say, intentional political ambition. Do you want to kind of talk about that, and specifically whether or not she reminded you of anyone that you might have worked with when you were in Istanbul?
Well, I mean, so Kristen works in the cultural affairs section of the consulate in Istanbul, and she is involved in Peter's life because he applies for a grant early on in the book from cultural affairs. She is involved in Catherine's life because, Catherine is married to a very prominent Turkish man who is a supporter of the arts, and, and she's American. So they sort of have intersections there. And so when, you first meet Kristen, you see her as she's a representative of the U.S. government. She has influence in Turkish society because of that position, but she's very much a part of the society as well. However, as the book progresses, you start to understand actually how deeply embedded she is in everybody's lives. And that many of these people are connected through Kristen. So, one of the things that interests me in writing the book, and I say it's sort of a political book as well, is that it's, there many times are these hidden architectures or not obvious architectures that connect many people together. And sometimes those architectures are not revealed and are not revealed how profound they are until there is a true moment of crisis, whether that is a political moment of crisis like the Gezi Park protests, or a personal moment of crisis like the dissolution of a marriage and a custody battle over a child. And in the book, you kind of have both of those crises occurring in tandem, and the reveal of these power structures, both political and personal, also occurring in tandem.
Yeah, it was very, I don't know, it at times felt like a thriller, because as you learn more and more how deeply Kristen is a part of each of these characters' lives in ways that they recognize, in ways they don't even know. And then you start to understand how these connections that they have with one another are not accidental, and that they're in some ways very intentional, based upon the way that Kristen wanted to use the various motivations of the characters for her own purposes.
Right, and she's very adept at that. And so, just as she is very much involved in each of their lives and is very central to each of their lives, they are also very central to her life. And so there's sort of the interplay there as well. And so you sort of see, I think the book starts out with this cast of characters who kind of seem as though they're arranged on the stage and have little to do with one another aside from, meeting at a party and bumping into each other. But as things progress, you start to see how profound their connections are to one another, even if not obvious, and how you could see them standing in a room together and have absolutely no idea how deeply they're connected to one another.
One of the things that I thought you did so masterfully was bring this level or this idea or premise of tension and equilibrium kind of through various different modalities in the novel. For instance, in Peter's photography, where he's trying to pair portraits that show a tension or a connection, or how people bind or hold each other or one another. And then through the political issues where you talk about through your characters, the strategic tension that is so very much a part of politics. I guess, I don't know, was that architecture kind of difficult to kind of build on all those different levels, or did it seem kind of to flow rather naturally?
Yeah, well, I think thematically it was something I was sort of interested about in the book, and how, our, the photographic negative of us defines us, the sort of the whole fire and ice that, you need your great adversary to define you, politically, what's a Republican without a Democrat, right? They don't, they need each other. They feed off each other. And so we see that very obviously in political life across countries. But you also see it in people's personal lives. There's an idea, it's a political idea from the 1970s in Italy, when the political right wing, it was discovered, was actually funding a lot of the far left groups that were attacking the right wing regime. And the right wing was funding those groups because they knew they needed them. They needed the specter of the far left threat to keep them relevant on the right. And so they called it the strategy of tension, was what it was called. And you see that strategy of tension played out in many, many facets. Everybody needs a foil. And so in this book, it's a political theme, and Peter tries to do that with his photography. He's trying to show images that are the opposites of one another, and to show that if you just show the one image, it has a very different reaction on you than if you show the two of them lined up. But it also has personal ramifications, and you see how people hold each other in these states of tension where they kind of can't move and are stuck in their lives. And without revealing too much, the book opens and Catherine's making a break for it. And so we see what happens. She's held in this state of equilibrium, and she knows she's being held in it. She doesn't understand explicitly how much she's being held in it, but she decides that she's going to make a break for it. And we sort of see what happens when she tries to do that.
Yeah, it's I think it's a powerful setup for so many aspects of the novel. One of the things that I liked a lot about the novel as well was some of the just exquisite imagery. And I think that years from now, I don't know that I'll remember every detail of this book that you've written, and I'm sure you're going to write many more between now and then. But I think one thing that's always going to stick with me is the image of Murat as a child learning to swim in the snow,
Mm-hmm.
and his father's watch. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? And I'd like to know as well whether or not that was based upon anything that you might have seen or heard, or that was just totally your imagination that created that wonderful image.
Well, there's a part of the book where, so Murat is, as I mentioned in the reading, he's a real estate developer, and his father was a real estate developer, but one with sort of a spotty track record. And so he's kind of like one of these, threadbare nobles. He's just trying to keep the family business going. And Kristen helps him with that a little bit. But one of his earliest childhood memories is his father owned the Shiran Palace Hotel in Istanbul, which is this totally spectacular hotel on the Bosphorus. It's a former palace of one of the Ottoman sultans. And his father owned the hotel, but he was deeply, deeply, deeply in debt, and business-wise it wasn't working, but the hotel had a swimming pool, and his father knew that he was going to have to sell his stake in the hotel, but he wanted to make sure that his son learned how to swim first. So he only had the period of the winter to do it. And so he would have take the pool out, and he'd run Murat out there in the snow, and then they'd jump in the pool, and he would try to teach Murat to swim. And so there's a scene early on where it's the description of Murat's father trying to teach him to swim in the snow, but the way he teaches him to swim is he basically just throws him in the pool.
And the father at one point has to go in and rescue his son, and he's wearing a very expensive watch at the time.
Yes, and so he's wearing the watch when he does that, and when he gets out, his father's furious because he has to rescue his son. His son is railing and punching against his father, and that is the moment in which Murat realizes that he's buoyant, that he can actually swim on his own. But there's also a great, so I've been to that hotel, and it's a totally spectacular and beautiful swimming pool, and imagined what it would be like. And I've been there in the winter where there's snow everywhere, and I've always wondered what it would be like to swim in that pool in the snow. So I guess that's part of the inspiration for that scene. And then, I'm going to blank on the exact song, but there's a great Pearl Jam song that's about them, one of them watching their son learn how to swim.
Oh.
And that song actually kind of, it's there's a line when Murat's father's saying to him, he's like, keep stroking, paddle hard, keep your chin up, boy, stuff like that. And that kind of comes from that one song, which is like any parent, I think you can, sympathize with watching your child try to learn how to swim, and all the struggle and the struggle and the struggle and the struggle, and in the moment when it connects and they realize they're buoyant. And so for Murat, it's the thing that makes him buoyant and pushes him over the edge is trying to basically punch his father. And his father goes to rescue him, ruining his own beautiful watch. And you see Murat later, he still wears that watch.
Even though it's broken. Yeah. That's a really great image. So I guess I'm going to ask whether or not did you start writing the book when you were working in Istanbul? Have you thought about the novel for a while? How did it come about?
I'm sure novel writing, it's sort of an interesting and iterative process. I started really writing this book in earnest in very late 2015, and into 2016 was nugging out the first draft of it. And then was probably mostly done with it by 2017 or 18. So yeah, but I was in Istanbul, initially when I was working on it, and then moved back to the States when it was still kind of underway. Oftentimes I find it's easier to write about a place if you're not in that place, because when you leave a place, it exists more vividly in your imagination. And by writing, you're transcribing that place from the imagination. Whereas if you're physically in a place, the place exists in your reality. And so you're not retreating to it into your imagination the same way.
Yeah. When I finished the book, I thought about all 5 of the adult characters, and whether or not they evolved or changed or transformed in any way. I have to say that I think I felt through most of the book that the adults acted like the relationships with one another were in some ways very transactional. There wasn't a lot, even between Catherine and Peter, it didn't seem like a great overwhelming passion. It was just kind of this is what you do for me, this is what I need, and this is what I give you, and that's the way it's going to be. I did think though that Peter evolved, and I saw the way that he evolved mostly through his art, his photography, because he starts out and the book opens with this showing that they're having a reception for of these portraits where he's trying to pair people who are kind of as you said, in some ways, like the yin and yang of each other, and have each other like suspended in this hold, or this tension. And then it seems that the book ends with his exhibit of the birds, and you don't know whether the birds are landing or flying away. And it seems to me to maybe represent some kind of freedom in his art, that he had kind of changed in that way, and maybe in a way personally too, that he felt more free. So I don't know, did it get that way right or way wrong?
However you get it is the right way to get it. But, I didn't feel like I definitely knew writing these characters, I wasn't trying to write characters who were evolving in some kind of evolving towards a resolution. Like, that just never felt like this book to me, and it wasn't what some of the book's about. Like, the book, maybe it's something like I'm a realist or feel like a realist writer. Like, I'm like, but the book is about what I think kind of how people are, which is like, we are who we are, and we all have limitations, and we often love one another despite the limitations, or don't love one another despite our limitations, and say, you know what, like, I think this is a person, they're in my life, and this is the role they fill in my life. And I can go to them for certain things, and they're great for certain things. And I know there are other things I'm just, I'm not going to get from them. Like, my mother-in-law has a saying I love, which she says, don't go to the hardware store for milk. Things you're just not going to get from certain people. So I think, like, like towards the end of the book with Peter and Catherine, like, the parameters of their relationship are clear, and there's some things that they're going to give one another, and there are other things that they are not going to give one another. And I think you see that too with, Murat and William, his son, although I think there is growth there. I think Murat, without giving too much away, I think he proves some things by the end of the book. And I think the same with Catherine. And it's sort of one of the themes of the book is exactly, you don't know whether the birds are landing or taking off. And most of us go our whole life without necessarily knowing with people if we're landing or taking off. We're sort of suspended with them. One of the things at the end of the book, which is a little kind of like a nod that I wouldn't expect most readers would get, American readers would get, I hope maybe Turkish readers would get it, but is that the book ends with basically a showing of Peter's photography. But the night of that exhibition is the night before the coup against Erdogan in Turkey.
Oh.
So if you look at the date, that's the day before the coup.
So is the book going to be translated into Turkish?
As they say. I have a Turkish publisher, so we're in the process of trying to sort that all out.
Okay.
They're doing Dark at the Crossing next.
Oh, good.
Oh, yeah.
Great. Well, then I'm sure they'll get to this one. That just seems natural.
See. Yeah, we'll see. But yeah, so, but I think it's interesting. And one of the things I love, this book comes out in a couple of days, is that, when a book comes out, so much of your subconscious writes a book. And people have always come to me who will then read a book later on, and they'll explain something that they see in the book that when they explain it to me makes total sense. I'm like, wow, you're right. I just was never thinking about that when I was writing the book, but it makes complete sense. And that's actually like one of the real, I find, joys of putting books out in the world.
Yeah.
Things in there that you never would have been able to see yourself.
Well, I think it's going to be a joy to put this book in people's hands next Tuesday and all through the summer. It's going to be, I think, a fantastic summer read. But speaking of reads, and because so many of us have more time to read, I wondered if you maybe could mention or talk about some things that you've been reading during this stressful time period, or maybe some of your writerly inspirations in terms of, whether for this book or your writing in general, who you go to in terms of inspiring you.
Oh, sure. I kind of read with very intentionally with like no real plan. So like things come across my radar and I sort of feel like that's the right thing to read. So I say that there's going to be a kind of a random list. So I read a book called Threshold recently by Rob Doyle, which I thought was great. He's an Irish writer. I really enjoyed that book. It's sort of it's a novel, but it's sort of auto fiction about his kind of travels around Europe and his experiments with psychedelics. But it's written really beautifully. It's pretty fascinating. Kevin Barry's Nightboat to Tangier. I just recently read. I'm a little bit late to the party on that one, but really, really loved it. And I'm reading the new translation of the 52 Chekhov stories. I'm sort of reading like one of those a night before I go to bed. So that's what's sort of been closest to me during the last couple of weeks of self-quarantine.
What do you, in terms of, if you had to say a few writers that have been a big influence for you just in your life as an author, where would you go with that?
In this book, I was reading lots of Turkish writers. A friend of mine, Uzgur Mumcu, who's a columnist for Cumhuriyet, which is a newspaper that's mentioned a lot in Red Dress and Black and White, and kind of holds a unique position in Turkish society. He wrote a great book, which Pushkin Press translated in English. I would recommend, called "The Peace Machine," which supposes that in the lead up to the First World War, an Ottoman scientist invents a peace machine, and what would happen to Turkish society if that peace machine were unleashed. So it's a really sort of fun bit of speculative fiction. He's a great writer. Burhan Sönmez's new book, or both of his books, Istanbul, is a fantastic book, and his new novel, Labyrinth, is definitely worth reading. In doing this book, I was definitely kind of interested in reading other writers who had written about Istanbul, the city, because the city itself, I wanted it to feel like a character in the book.
And it does. It really does. I'm trying to think of Turkish authors that I've read, and the only one that comes to mind is Orhan Pamuk.
Right. Well, he's great in sort of the giant. I mean, Elif Shafak, she's amazing.
Yeah.
Is just a great writer and prolific. So if you're interested, she has many, many books you could read. Her novel Honor is one of my favorites. Those have been some of my go-tos. And I like to do Audible. I started doing Audible I'm very late to the party on that. I started doing about a year ago, but I do lots of nonfiction on Audible. I think that's a kind of a good way to pass the time.
Great. Well, can you give us a little preview of what's next for you? Because you, I don't know, this is your fourth novel, I think, and then you've also have many, or at least a few nonfiction books.
Right. So what's next for me is a little bit of a departure. A friend of mine is a guy named Admiral James Stavridis, and he is a retired 4-star admiral in the Navy. His last job was he was the head of NATO. And he and I have co-written a work of speculative fiction of what it would look like if the U.S. and China went to war in the year 2034. And so the novel is called 2034, A Speculation. And so it's sort of a fun book, kind of a departure, big cast of characters, lots of action, but also lots of, speculation of like, what's the world going to look like in about 14 years. So that comes out in March of 2021. And it was a lot of fun. I've never worked with someone before, and he's great. We had lots of fun kind of figuring out where this story would go and what we would include and who the central characters would be. I hope it will cause people to sort of think about where we are today and where we might be going. And it's always fun for me to get to do something new.
Well, I look forward to that, and we look forward to having you back to talk about that one. That does sound like a departure and really, really fun.
Fun. It's a fun book.
Yeah. I noticed that you've got, at least I think I've seen 3 dogs behind you running around.
Oh yeah, they're out there.
They're sheltering with you.
Sheltering with me. Yeah, we've got a whole little wolf pack here.
That's excellent. Well, Elliot Ackerman, thank you so much for joining Interabang's Author Chats. We really appreciate your time and having you, and it's great to see you and to know that you're doing well.
You too, Lori. Thanks for having me, and thanks for everything you guys are doing to put books into people's hands.
And look forward to this book. It's really good.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.